To discuss racism in the United States in 2024, during Black History Month, we must acknowledge that this nation was founded explicitly on the notion that white people of European ancestry were naturally superior to anyone and everyone else. White people were believed they were superior to the native inhabitants of this continent. White people were superior to the African peoples they enslaved. God said so, or so the colonizers claimed, to justify brutal genocide. White supremacy is in the foundational DNA of this nation. It is baked in, like cast iron seasoned with spicy chorizo. The bitter flavor of white supremacy lingers forever, tainting every food cooked afterwards with its spice. I speak this morning, like so many ministers in our movement, to a congregation made up statistically, overwhelmingly, of white people. White people, if we want to get specific, with a certain degree of privilege, generally educated, often overeducated, generally affluent, upper middle class, mostly able-bodied, at least for now, mostly native-born, US citizens, mostly native speakers of English. Yes, there are a few exceptions, but by and large, we are a group that holds a lot of those identities, and they afford us a lot of privilege. So what can a well-intentioned white minister say to a group of similarly well-intentioned, mostly white people to drive home an understanding of white supremacist culture in a way that inspires us all to actively work for justice and equity? Let me start with a very basic, simple truth then. I am racist, and so are you. I am racist in the same way a fish is wet. I am racist, and so are you, because we swim in the white supremacist culture that is the very foundation of this nation. It is the air we breathe. There's a story about a very old salmon heading upstream to spawn. He is old, jaw is hooked, back hump and bright red. This is his final journey. As he goes, he passes a couple of younger fish, barely a year old. "How's the water, boys?" he asks as he labors past. "Fine, just fine," they answer. After the old fish has swum past, one of the younger ones looks at his companion and asks, "What's water?" This is the world in which we live. We don't see the water because we are in it. It is in us. We swim in the water of white supremacist culture, largely invisible to us unless we carry one or more of a number of historically targeted identities. In the same way, the person with the life-threatening allergy to peanuts can tell when somebody 15 rows back on an airplane has opened a Snickers bar, those who do not fit the ideal model of straight, white, Protestant Christian are aware that there is poison in the air that can kill them long before many other people even get a hint. A few words this morning about Strange Fruit. Strange Fruit was written by Abel Meeropol. He was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants in Brooklyn. He wrote it as a poem in 1937 and later set it to music. Billie Holiday heard the song and immediately included it in her performance repertoire. Some audiences loved it, some were offended, but no matter what, it stirred strong emotions regardless. She recorded the piece in 1939 with a small independent label called Commodore Records. Columbia had refused to risk the likely backlash of recording such a song. There was a man named Harry Anslinger. He was the racist commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And he was so opposed to the song and the artist and the message that he set up Billie Holiday in a drug sting, had some of his agents sell her heroin, and she ended up in prison for over a year. She also lost her license to perform in cabarets upon her release in 1948. She still performed, although was harassed. Years later, after her release, she succumbed to the ravages of alcohol and drug addiction and was admitted to the hospital with heart and liver and all manner of problems in 1959. Anslinger sent his agents into the hospital where they handcuffed Holiday to her gurney, and then Anslinger ordered the doctors to provide no further medical treatment. She died a few days later at the age of 44. There was no rope, there was no tree, but that was very much a lynching. Like I said before, white privilege is largely invisible to those of us who carry it. In novels, we don't read about white characters, they're just characters. If they're black or brown or some other shade, that is remarked upon as early and often. White characters simply just are. It is easy for us to look back at this story and say, the story of Billie Holiday, and say, well, thank goodness that happened nearly 100 years ago. Certainly we have progressed far beyond that kind of brutality and mindset. And yet, just yesterday, in Sunbury, across the river, a group marched, calling themselves a movement for White Lives Matter. They waved U.S. flags and neo-Nazi flags as they disrupted traffic and then marched through downtown on the sidewalk. They drew attention of residents, some who shouted at them and made their own signs in opposition of their message, before they finally jumped into a car with the license plate obscured by a U.S. flag and drove away. Yesterday, here, it is not over, not by a long shot. And this is the foundational genetic profile of this nation. We Unitarian Universalists, progressive of faith, progressive of philosophy, progressive of politics, are not immune to the effects of white supremacist culture. The American Unitarian Association was established more than 100 years ago as an intentionally exclusive bastion of white men from Harvard. No, really, that's what they were. And it's that foundational DNA that caused so many denominational leaders to get a nearly terminal case of the vapors when someone suggested that the UUA move its national headquarters out of Boston to where the Board of Trustees, when the Board of Trustees decided to sell our historic headquarters on Beacon Street next to the Capitol. Vapors. The notion of venturing beyond the safety of Boston's I-495 corridor was simply unthinkable. That kind of change is as unthinkable in this century as it was unthinkable for the American Unitarian Association to entertain the notion of black clergy in the 20th century. That is the best ringtone ever. A minister named Ethelred Brown was a black man from Jamaica, and he applied again and again for support to start a congregation in his home nation of Jamaica, in Kingston. Repeatedly, he was rebuffed. At one point, he did get some funding, but it was cut off after a few years. Our beloved Unitarian Universalist Association has dropped the ball when it comes to racial justice many times. In 1963, the delegates at General Assembly declined to pass a measure requiring association member congregations to have policies prohibiting discrimination or segregation based on race. Later, what became known as the Black Empowerment Movement, African American UUs formed a coalition and petitioned for funds and other support to help attract and retain people of color to UU congregations. They got rousing support at General Assembly that year, which happened 2 months after Dr. King was murdered. But in subsequent years, strings were attached to that multi-year grant, requiring a full vote of GA for the organization to receive its promised money every year. And people in the floor discussion poked and prodded about details of the money management, much the way disgruntled voters criticized the annual school budget at a town council meeting. There were good folks who tried hard, and other folks who didn't see why Black folks needed support in the first place. And still more who thought UUism was not the right place for people of color at all. At one point, a huge delegation of people of color walked out of General Assembly. Many never returned. Another story you may well know. 1993, what was then the Thomas Jefferson District was hosting General Assembly. You all know this story? Some do, some don't. The organizers of General Assembly thought it would be delightful to have a fancy party with a period costume dress-up element. This is 1993. They are the Thomas Jefferson District. Black members and people of color gathered together, had a conversation, and 2 delegates, Hope and Janice Johnson, Black women in our movement, approached the microphone at General Assembly and said simply, "Would you have us dress in chains?" Shortly after that, we went to the region sort of thing instead of districts, and they got rid of the Thomas Jefferson name entirely, and we became the something something priestly district, right? We try hard, we mean well, ooh boy. The fact is that systems are designed to sustain and protect themselves. Systems are designed to resist change, and when change comes to one part of the system, the whole system freaks out and convulses in an effort to resist that change. If that change is going to stay, the whole system must adjust, and that means every part of the system. This is familiar territory to anyone who has worked in addiction recovery or family systems theory. Yes? Some of those folks, yes? When one person in an addicted family gets well, the whole family loses its mind and behaves in ways, intentional or otherwise, designed to bring that errant member back into compliance with the system as it is. The system simply does not know how to operate when someone begins to demand truth and transparency and, heaven forbid, accountability. This cultural convulsing is described by Robin DiAngelo in her groundbreaking book as white fragility. Now, I have to say I was initially resistant to the term white fragility because it seemed like a judgment of moral failing. But what DiAngelo describes is something very different. White people do not have the necessary emotional or spiritual muscle memory to deal with racial discomfort or challenge. Let me say that again. White people do not have the necessary emotional or spiritual muscles to deal with racial discomfort or challenge. We, and I use that term intentionally because I am white-skinned and I enjoy white privilege, we have never had to live in situations where we were the perpetual outsiders, where we were discriminated against systemically because of who we are or who we appear to be. Now, I want you to put aside right now that one time a person of color was mean to you in school, or that neighborhood where you used to live when you were an undergrad, where you were one of the few white families, or that someone in your family married a person of color and therefore you know what it's like. You don't. You don't, and neither do I. We cannot know what it is to every day wake up in a nation, in a culture founded on the notion that you and your ancestors and your progeny are not human. We cannot know that. There is no nation on earth where the founding ethos was rooted in the notion that white people were inherently inferior and must be enslaved, terrorized, and subjugated to keep them down. None. There may be pockets of culture where white folks are unwelcome, but the large difference there is that white folks have historically had the ability to leave when they are uncomfortable. When schools integrated, white folks moved to the suburbs. When public pools were integrated, backyard pools suddenly became a thing where people could afford them. Want to guess who could afford them? White people. In some cities, when pools were integrated, rather than allow white children to swim with black children, municipalities simply filled in the pools with dirt. Nobody gets to swim. White fragility is when bad things happen to white people and there is an understanding that something is wrong about it. It's not supposed to happen. Although communities of color have been dealing with heroin addiction for decades, it is only an outrage since addiction moved to the suburbs. Suddenly, white people notice. In her article, in her book, D'Angelo describes a series of indicators, symptoms, if you will, that point toward white fragility. White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. It also, we should include, that somewhere in our heads, we shut down and say, this minister is nuts, I'm not listening. Okay? These behaviors, in turn, function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. Racial stress results from an interruption to what is racially familiar. One of the key points she makes is that white people, or people who experience white privilege, is that we are utterly unequipped to deal with any form of racial discomfort. We expect to not have our comfort challenged in any way. And when someone suggests that we might be wrong, that our point of view is rooted in our own privilege, when we are forced to acknowledge that there are systems of oppression and imbalances of power that favor people with white skin, we do those things she described. We get defensive, we get angry, we are ashamed, we are outraged, we are offended. We expect comfort. We expect, frankly, segregation. We expect to be able to talk whenever we like and be believed. We expect all the movie heroes to look like us. You remember the freak out when they redid Little Mermaid? The white right lost its mind about the realism of a black mermaid. Little Mermaid. Yep. We expect our experience is considered the standard or normal one, and that others are wrong or inferior. We expect to always feel like we fit in wherever we go, and that to not fit is wrong. We expect to be free of the psychic burden of race. White is the standard, only people of color experience race, thus rendering it not our problem. And honestly, we are not practiced at listening and following. We like to lead. And white leadership is precisely the thing Black voices do not need in this moment. All right, Sabrina, let's take a look at a piece of that video that started our service today, the one with Legend. And I want you to pay special attention to what the white members of the chorus are doing. Can we play that clip? Here we go. Mm-hmm. The war is won. Glory. When it's all said and done. Glory. We'll cry glory. Glory. Oh, glory. Oh, glory. Did you see that? What were they doing? They were not singing. All right. Damn, YouTube's giving us fits this morning. The music's nice. I have a bad feeling this is going to be one of those anti-coffee things. We got it? Good. Excellent. And that was intentional. That was designed that way. They wanted, and that's as a message, and this is 10 years ago. The message was that we are needed, but not needed to be leaders. We need to support the leaders of the Black movement, okay? And we do that by showing up and not making our own noise to distract anything, okay? I had a conversation once with a group of white men who were flat out incensed that they had asked to be silent during a conversation about race. Furious. Of course their opinions were valuable. Of course their words were important. And if I can't talk, I'm not going to be here. And they left. And I'm willing to bet that those men would claim not to be racist. In fact, I've heard each and every one of them say just that. I'm not racist. Fragility is real, friends. And I am aware enough. I mean, it's a humbling thing to find out what you don't know. It's a humbling thing to realize that you've been doing it wrong before. And I am aware enough to know that I am racist. I believe that we all in this room experience a type of racism. We have absorbed the messages of our dominant culture. I know that's a challenging thing to hear. What does your body do when you hear me say that? Do you feel tension, anger, shame, defensiveness? Do you want to say, screw it, the minister's a nut, and walk out the door? First, I will say you will not be the first or the last to think that. These are all things that Robin DiAngelo describes, and this is how we can recognize our own white fragility. The more angry this sermon makes you, the more fragile you likely are. I wonder, can you say it with me? I am racist. I am racist. Now sit with that for a minute. It's tough. It's tough. You know the things I told you today are real. I'm citing academic sources to a group of people who appreciate peer-reviewed academic sources because you're overeducated, remember? The evidence points to the reality that we who grew up in this country, who live and breathe and swim in the air of our culture, must be, by nature of the water and the air that we breathe, racist. And this is an adjective, not a noun. This is the difference between being racist and being a racist. One is a source. The difference is guilt and shame. Like, guilt isn't bad. Shame is bad. Shame is where we get stuck, right? So this is about acknowledging that we are not all that we could be. And no, we didn't start this stuff, right? Started at the root with the Pilgrims. But this is the world we inherited, and it is our problem to address. If you buy a house and the roof leaks, you fix the roof. You don't allow the leak to stay because you didn't cause it. Because if you allow it to stay, it will cause greater and greater damage to the home. Now, I need to make a confession of sorts. I have screwed up justice work my entire life. I've done it wrong. I've made it about me. I've said the wrong things at exactly the wrong times. And I've made grave errors that make me wince still after a decade or more. And I make grave errors still. I grew up in a place where all the isms were largely the norm. Racism, sexism, heterosexism, anti-Semitism, transphobia, all of them. I knew early that they were wrong, but I lacked the language, skill, and courage to fight them for a very long time. More than once, I have felt particularly smug and superior about my level of enlightenment around justice issues, only to abruptly put my foot in my mouth in a very public and embarrassing way. It feels like each thing I learn in this work shines a bright and ugly light on how poorly I've done it in the past. I get paralyzed sometimes by fear of doing it badly again. My desire not to screw up can keep me from acting at all, and that's not good either. I have spent too much time apologizing for my ineptitude and shame for not doing it right. And I'll tell you, marginalized folks do not need my white guilt or shame or tears. They need me to shut up and listen and learn and keep trying. I expect I will still screw things up as I go. What I need to remember is that we all have to start somewhere. I feel I'm late to the party on a lot of fronts. And in other places, I get impatient with folks who are just learning about their own privilege. Compassion is good stuff all around. I need to be compassionate with those just catching up, and I need to be compassionate with myself for not being perfect at this stuff already. For you and for me and for the world, may this be our practice and our prayer. Amen.